So turn with me to Ruth chapter 3, and let's begin here at the beginning of chapter 3 with verse 1. Read along with me if you don't have your Bible. It says, "One day Naomi said to Ruth, 'My daughter, it's time that I found a permanent home for you so that you'll be provided for. Boaz is a close relative of ours,'" meaning of her husband's, not of hers. That would be really gross. "He's a close relative of ours, and he's been very kind by letting you gather grain with his young women. Tonight he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor." It's another phrase that you and I probably aren't very accustomed to hearing. But so after Ruth, she works in this barley field for several months. Naomi, her mother-in-law, she decides it's time to find Ruth a permanent home. Naomi does this because she wants Ruth to be provided for. And this is really important because I've said before, widows 3,200 years ago around the Middle East were the poorest people there were. They were almost completely dependent upon men. Now, I know today I don't need no man, right? But 3,200 years ago, culture was such that a woman without the husband to provide the labor and stuff, because they had very distinct responsibilities. For the women, as old-fashioned as it sounds, it was bearing children. That was such an honor to the women. That's why a woman who was barren was so shameful, like she was so disgraced. But that was her goal in life, was to give the husband children and to take care of them and cook and things like that. But if you didn't have a man in your life, it was really hard to be provided for. And so there were a lot of widows and elderly widows who were very poor. So God had put in place things to protect the widows, and like the kinsman redeemer law. But they still had a rough life. And when I think about what Naomi says here to Ruth, I think about how unselfish she is. Because how many of you guys know, and maybe some of you are here in the room today, how many of you, like if you were alone, maybe your husband passed away, and you just had a daughter-in-law like Ruth, how many of you would actually go out of your way to try to get her married and get her out of your house? Like, there are a lot of people who would pull that pity card every day. "Oh, nobody's going to take care of me." Or, "Oh, I need, who's going to take care of me if you're gone? You're going to leave me alone. I'm just going to die." And, you would think that a lot of widows would be more like that. But Naomi, all she cared about was that Ruth had a fulfilling life. And it was a very, very unselfish gesture that she wants Ruth to be provided for. She wants her to get remarried, even knowing that it's going to make Ruth a lonely widow herself. So this becomes her top priority. So she tells Ruth that Boaz is going to be winnowing tonight at the threshing floor. So let me explain what this is. We got a picture. It's a real picture. Not one of my goofy ones, but let me explain a little bit what this is. If you're into farming, they do it different now. They have great machines, but back 3,200 years ago, barley is similar to wheat, and it's a grain. It grows in stalks. And so what they would do is they would plant it, and then when it's time to harvest, they would pull the stalks up, and they would take it onto what's called a threshing floor. A threshing floor is a large flat surface, usually of stone, maybe on the top of a mountain. Okay, so the peak of a mountain that's large, it's flat, and they would put all the bundles of wheat, or barley in this case, on the threshing floor, and they would shake the bejesus out of it, and the kernels of barley would drop onto the flat surface, and then they would throw the stalks out. After you do this for a long time, you have a whole big pile of barley. Make sense? Okay? And so then the next step would be to winnow it. If you ever had a peanut, like out of a shell, you take the peanut and you see that little husk, that little flaky skin that goes over the top of the actual peanut. Well, wheat and barley have something similar. It's called a chaff. And so these guys, they'll take this winnowing fork and they'll dig it into the barley and they'll throw it up in the air, which makes a cool 80s rock video too, if they're into that. It probably worked 3,200 years ago. But they will take this stuff and they'll fling it up in the air, and that's why they have these threshing floors on the top of a mountainside, because it's really windy, and the wind would blow the chaff away from the barley or the wheat itself. And so you hear Jesus talking about separating the wheat from the chaff. That's basically what it's doing. It's taking your winnowing fork into the grain, throwing it up in the air, allowing the wind to do its thing, and it separates the barley from the chaff. So I just tell you all that just so that you have context. So Naomi says to Ruth, go to the field. Tonight, Boaz is going to be doing this. He's going to be winnowing on the threshing floor. Let's continue to read in verse 3. She says to Ruth, do as I tell you, take a bath and put on some perfume and dress in your nicest clothes. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz see you until he has finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down, and then go uncover his feet and lie down there. He will tell you what to do. I will do everything you say, Ruth replied. So during the heart of the barley harvest, workers, they spent the whole day on the field for weeks and weeks, because this was one of 2 harvests in the Middle East that they would experience throughout the year. Since the work was so labor-intensive, the men would usually just sleep on the floor, and the owner of the field would usually sleep on the pile of barley or wheat or whatever the crop was, mainly to keep people from coming and stealing it. So they wouldn't leave until the job was done. So Boaz, being the owner of the field, when he was done working, he would eat and he would lay down on the barley field and he would sleep there. So Naomi, she instructs Ruth. She knows that how this works in this culture. So she instructs her daughter-in-law to get all gussied up and then go wait for nighttime. She says, make sure you notice where he lays down, because there would be other people that would be sleeping nearby. He's like, so don't go to the wrong guy. That's not part of the plan. So get all gussied up and wait for nighttime. See where he's going to lay down at, and then once he's in a good sound sleep, then go and lay down. Go there by him. And Naomi, she didn't know exactly what Boaz's reaction was going to be when he realized there's a woman laying down by him. But she assumed and she had hoped for Boaz to have a good reaction, that he would be welcoming for her to be somebody that he'd be interested in. So she was kind of like this matchmaker type that had that woman's tuition. I've seen some of you guys, you got that women's tuition. I'm not a good matchmaker, by the way. If I ever try to set you up, just ignore me, because it's probably bad. But Naomi was good at this, and so it was a bit of a gamble, though, because if Boaz woke up and was like, what are you doing? Get out of here, then it would be weird, and Ruth probably would have to leave the field, and who knows, maybe she would go back to her homeland in Moab, and the whole thing would be over with. So it was kind of a gamble. Let's continue reading verse 6. It says, so Ruth went down to the threshing floor that night and followed the instructions of her mother-in-law. After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down at the far end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she replied. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer. So, as you can imagine, upon hearing this, you can imagine what Boaz's reaction was. I think we had a picture of that. Yeah, he was pretty excited as he looked down and saw this pretty young woman at his feet. Let's put those verses back up there if you can. Okay, so single women, okay, or if you know anyone that's single, we have a recipe here for a solid marriage, and here's how it is. This is how you land a husband. You wait till their bellies are full, okay? After you finish eating, you wait till they take a nap, you went to sleep, and then you just kindly tell him when he wakes up, you're going to marry me. That's it. It's easy. Friend, you didn't have to go through all the the centerpiece, all that. All you have to do is just like, hey, you're my redeemer, you're going to marry me. Feed them, give them a comfortable place to sleep, and tell them you're going to marry them. And you'll also notice Spread the corner of your blanket over me. You'll also notice that for over 3,200 years, women have been stealing our blankets. It's not a new thing. This has been going on forever. Amen. It's proof. So it's not just us being crazy. The Bible tells us. Because Boaz woke up the next morning freezing. He had no blankets whatsoever. Actually, a lot of things in Hebrew culture are very symbolic. They were very symbolic people. Just to give you an example, when you read a lot of the prophets, you'll notice that prophets did things that were symbolic to communicate a message from God to the people. For example, Ezekiel, he shaved half of his beard off to show that half of Israel was going to be, kind of go through a major punishment and so forth. Isaiah, he walked naked for 2 years in the land of the Middle East to show that Ethiopia and Egypt would be barren and would have nothing. And so it was symbolic in how they did things. What Ruth asked here to spread the corner of your blanket over me for you and my family to do, this was also a symbolic gesture. In ancient custom, it symbolized that the man would cover the woman and be her provider. So even though she probably was inclined to steal his blankets because she's female, she was actually asking him to be her redeemer, and this was the custom. If the man would cover her with his blanket, it was like metaphorically covering her physically in every way, providing for her, etc. So she was asking Boaz to be her family redeemer. So how did Boaz respond? Well, he was very flattered. In verse 10, he tells her this: "The Lord bless you, my daughter," Boaz exclaimed. "You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor." So Naomi's intuition was right. She's a good matchmaker. She obviously saw that Boaz had some eyes for Ruth. And some of what we read here, I like to just put it into context because it's easy for us to read from our 21st century minds and miss some of this stuff. But he says that you showed great family loyalty here. He was impressed with Ruth more because Ruth was concerned with redeeming her family so much that she was willing to marry an older guy, or didn't matter who he was. She really wanted to honor her family, her dead husband and her husband's father and so forth. So she was so willing to honor her family that it didn't matter who Boaz was. And so again, in this culture, Boaz was really impressed by that because that was a very honorable thing to do. And so he says to her, "You're showing even more family loyalty." Because she could have started a life over back in Moab with a young man or whatever, but she wanted to honor her family and have a legacy to pass down. So Boaz responds in verse 11, "Now don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in town knows you're a virtuous woman." So Boaz agrees to be her family redeemer. He makes a subtle statement here, though. He says, I will do whatever is necessary because, this word "for," wherever it is, right here, that joins these two. He says, I will do this because you're a virtuous woman. Why is this important? It's important because Ruth is not an Israelite woman, is she? She's a Moabite woman. And you remember a couple weeks ago, God had told Jewish people or Israelite people not to marry outside of the Hebrew faith. Because they were under a covenant. They were under the law of Moses. They were to live their life a certain way. And he didn't want them to be pulled into different directions by people who worship false gods, etc. Because he didn't want to lose his children. So he told them to marry within the confines of the Hebrew faith. And so, but he says, I will do this because everyone knows you're a virtuous woman. You see, Israelites were bound by the law of Moses, and so everything that God gave through the law about immorality and adultery and all of those things, Hebrew women had to live by, and so that's why Hebrew men would marry them women and so forth. But Ruth, even though she was a Moabite woman, she wasn't raised under the law of Moses. She was married to a man who was. Her best friend, her mother-in-law Naomi, was. And now she was living among people who were. And so do you remember when she decided to follow Naomi? And Naomi said, why don't you just go marry some young guy, start your life, your family's here, your gods are here. Remember what Naomi said? She said, wherever you go, I'll go. And whatever God you serve, I'm going to serve, right? Mm-hmm. Ruth made this choice to serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Naomi's God. And therefore, whatever their laws were concerning immorality, Ruth was now a part of. And so Boaz recognizes this. He says, I will redeem you because you're a virtuous woman, even though you're not an Israelite woman. Right? You just read through that, you kind of miss that. It's a really important step. But there's one catch. There's one catch in this whole story. We read in verse 12. He says, But while it's true that I am one of your family redeemers, there is another man who is more closely related to you than I am. Again, closely related to her husband, not to her. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him. And if he is willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he is not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you myself. So Boaz, he drops this bombshell on Naomi's plan here to be Cupid. He tells Ruth that there's another man who is first in line to be Ruth's family redeemer. That means there's another guy in the Bethlehem area there that is more closely related to Ruth's dead husband than he is. Maybe it's an older cousin or whatever it is. We don't know exactly what the relationship is there. But he, according to law, has the first rights to redeem Ruth's family before Boaz. Now, Boaz could have probably tried to sneak and do this and just not mention anything, but he is a man of integrity and honors God above everything. So he says, I'm going to have to check with him and see what he wants to do. And if he wants to be your redeemer, he has the first rights, and we're just going to have to let that go. And then he tells her this in the next line. He says, now lie down here till morning. So Ruth lay at Boaz's feet until the morning, but she got up before it was light enough for people to recognize each other. For Boaz has said, no one must know that a woman was here at the threshing floor. It's important to know that Ruth, even though this is her pitch to show Boaz that she was available and really would love for him to redeem her, she wasn't intimate with him. She wasn't like that. It wasn't like she had morals, and so did Boaz, for that matter. In fact, Boaz wanted to make sure that there wasn't even an appearance of sexual immorality. So he said, okay, you can lay here. You're going to steal my covers, I already know. But in the morning, before anybody gets up, because there are other people around there, and generally women weren't at the field threshing barley, says make sure that you get out before other people wake up and see you, and then they'll assume something, right? If your guy wakes up and there's a girl laying next to you, everybody's going to take it to social media or whatever. They're going to assume that there were some things there. So he says this with the final closing words in chapter 3, verse 15. Then Boaz said to Ruth, bring your cloak and spread it out. He measured 6 scoops of barley into the cloak and placed it on her back. Then he returned to the town. When Ruth went back to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, what happened, my daughter? Ruth told Naomi everything Boaz had done for her. And then she added, he gave me these 6 scoops of barley and said, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said to her, just be patient, my daughter, until we hear what happens. The man won't rest until he has settled things today. So Boaz, he had Ruth spread like her coat out. He put 6 scoops of food. He wrapped it up, put it on her back. He said, go take this back to your mother-in-law. Men, this is a good way to get into your woman's family if you're trying to land her. And she, in the chapter closes with Naomi being hopeful that Boaz is going to take care of Ruth. So I don't know if Naomi knew there was a closer relative or not. This could have been a shock to her. But she was hoping and praying that Boaz would be the man that could marry Ruth. But either way, she was comforted that Ruth was going to have somebody to redeem her family. And she was pretty excited about that. So we close out that chapter today. Just a quick review on what God is showing us is that, for one, Naomi wants to provide a permanent home for Ruth, which that itself is a very unselfish act, because that meant that Naomi was going to be alone, but she didn't care about herself. She only cared that Ruth was taken care of. Naomi gives Ruth instructions on how to land a husband. She tells her, basically, get cleaned up, wait till he eats, wait till he takes a nap, tell him he's going to marry you, and then steal his blankets. That was the way that she did it. But Ruth does ask him to cover her with his blanket, which symbolizes, being her family redeemer. Boaz agrees that he will marry Ruth only if a closer relative who has the legal right chooses not to. The law of the kinsman redeemer was not forced on relatives. So even though it was a way that God provided for widows, it wasn't forced on men. So if you women are married to a man and your husband dies and you don't have children, and your husband's brother says, "No, I don't want to marry you," God doesn't force him to marry. I mean, what kind of relationship would that be anyway? So if they choose not to, then you could go to first cousin, or whatever the order is. But that's how it worked. And then finally we close the chapter with Boaz buttering up Naomi, trying to get into her good graces. So by this time, Boaz is very much interested in Ruth. Probably over the few months, he probably developed some feelings for her. And I'm sure this was a really challenging time when Boaz realized that he could marry Ruth, a very beautiful woman, and give her the honor of redeeming her family, which was an honor for Ruth and for Boaz. But he also knew that there could be somebody that's never met her that has the legal right to marry her before me. And so that was probably very hurtful to think that this guy is probably going to take one look at her and say, "Yeah, I'll marry her." So it was a very difficult time for Ruth because he didn't know what this other person was going to do. But we're going to know what this other person is going to do next week when we finish the story. Okay? So we'll finish the book of Ruth next week, and we'll talk about how it applies to today. Because there's an awesome symbol of the story of Ruth and how it connects with the gospel of Jesus Christ in our life. So we're going to stop there for today. And as these guys come back up, it's Thanksgiving Thursday. It's Thursday. And as we're reading through these chapters in the book of Ruth, Naomi and Ruth, they could have easily lived a poor and lonely life with no men. In fact, that's usually what happened to widows, is they would be very, very poor. But Boaz went out of his way to make sure to help them in every way they could. He was very generous. He was very thankful to God for what God has given him. And so he shared the generosity that God has blessed him with to provide for people who really needed it. People who really couldn't provide for themselves in the same way that he could. This Thursday, there's going to be people who are stuck home in quarantine. There will be people who are stuck in nursing homes that can't even have their spouse visit them or their family. There are going to be people who are very alone, people who have lost their job, people who can't afford Thanksgiving meal or whatever. And I don't really know what all we can do under quarantine guidelines and things like that, but my hope and prayer is that every one of you guys and every one of you guys watching will try to think about things that God has blessed you with and what you have an abundance of because of God's great provision in your life and who you can be a blessing to. For us, I think we're going to try to take some food to the nursing home. I'm going to talk to them tomorrow. I'm hoping they allow us to. I don't know. But think about the gracious gift of life and abundance that God has given all of you guys here today. And think about, how can I be Boaz to this community? How can I be Boaz to people around me that don't have the things that I have? Maybe it's not anything, maybe other than a conversation, encouragement, spending time with them, whatever it is, I don't know. But I hope that in the next few days every one of you guys will be in prayer about what can I do to be kind and show my gratefulness to the Lord by doing for others.